Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to show you how I fertilize my orchids, and it's getting pretty hot here in New York City and everything's growing actively, so now is an important time to feed everything and make sure it's set up for success because everything's working on new growths, things are blooming, and orchids really bloom when you give it care through the year when they're actively growing. So I'm going to share a couple of different ways on the way that I fertilize my orchids, some tricks so that you don't have to check the TDS reading every single time that you're feeding the orchids. I find that in the beginning when I first started growing, I was very precise with how I was feeding my orchids, and then I kind of let that go a little bit. So I'll show you what I've done and exactly how I'm feeding my orchids. If you guys like this kind of video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more orchid content. With that said, let's jump right in. Let's start with the easiest way to fertilize. If you're growing organically, you can use a time release fertilizer. I got this one from Repotme.com. I will link it down below. But an easy way to fertilize your orchids is to just go ahead and use something that you have in the pot already. That way you don't have to remember to feed every time. The way that slow fertilizer works is it's temperature activated. So when you're watering and the temperature is above 70 degrees, it'll release some of that fertilizer. This particular brand lasts for 4 months. And the ratios that Repotme.com suggests are half a teaspoon for 3 to 4 inch pots, and then you can go all the way up to 1 to 2 teaspoons for up to 10 inch pots. So I'd say half a teaspoon for a 4 inch pot, and then maybe 3/4 of a teaspoon for a 5 to 6 inch pot, 8 inch pot, 1 teaspoon, and then 10 inch pot. Then you can double that up. But I think that's the easiest way to feed your orchids. You could just put it in your pot. If it's organic only, I wouldn't suggest doing that for anything in SemiHydro because that's always wet. And if the temperatures happen to be over 70 degrees, all of that will release all at once. So this is for if you have wet dry cycles. I recommend using the slow release fertilizer. When I first started growing, I used it for SemiHydro, and then I learned about the temperature change. So that's something to keep in mind. The next methods that I will show you are for both organic and inorganic. So another way that you could feed your orchid is by using regular fertilizer where you feed every time. And this one is also from Repotme.com. This is their MSU Fertilizer. So MSU stands for Michigan State University. They've done studies along the years on the best possible formulas to grow orchids, and this in short includes calcium and magnesium that a lot of the big box fertilizers don't have. A lot of times they have like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but they lack the calcium and magnesium. So this one includes it, and it also includes some micronutrients as well. I'm finding very good success with it, so I really like it, and I use it every time I water. Since I grow semi-hydroponically, I don't use the slow release fertilizer on everything, but I do this. The way that I feed is initially I measure my water to see what the TDS is in my water. TDS stands for total dissolved solids. So I will use a TDS meter. And luckily for me, I live in New York City. We have very high quality water, and my TDS is generally between 20 and 40. So I just checked my water. It's 40 right now, so it's pretty low. I don't have to use RO water, reverse osmosis water, or distilled water or anything like that. So I'm pretty lucky where I could use my own tap water. So I highly recommend you check out your water, the quality of it. If it's extremely high, you may want to use RO water because if not, they're going to get lots of minerals in the pots, and orchids have very sensitive roots. With 40 parts per million in the water, I'm fine using my fertilizer, but then I make some adaptations. So Repotme.com, they suggest if you follow the instructions, you can absolutely do that. I do make a couple of modifications because I like to add a couple more things into my water, but Repotme.com suggests using 3/4 teaspoons per gallon in the fall and winter of this, and 1 teaspoon per gallon in the spring and summer. So I do think it is very important to feed more in the summer and spring months than it is in the winter for things that are actively growing, because they're going to need more, they're going to grow more in the summer and the spring. In the winter, they're growing a little less. I don't feed orchids that are not growing at all, like catasetums, for example, or anything that's going dormant. I don't feed those. But I do think that you do have to adapt. However, I think a good way to not be tied to your TDS meter every single time you're making a mix is to know what your TDS is in your water. If it's pretty stable, I don't think you have to check all the time. And then I measure what Repotme.com suggests. So I started with 3/4 of a teaspoon with my water, and I checked it out to see what the final reading was. So this 3/4 teaspoon of this MSU fertilizer plus my 40 parts per million in my water came out to 400 parts per million per 3/4 teaspoon. I try to aim for about 300 parts per million total dissolved solids when I'm feeding my orchids in the spring and summer. If it's more than that, it's fine. I try not to do too much. I don't want to overfeed the orchids and get too much mineral buildup. So when I'm feeding my orchids, whether they're organic or in SemiHydro, what I actually do is I adapt the amount for this, and instead of 3/4 teaspoons, which is 400 parts per million, I feed 1/2 teaspoon of the MSU fertilizer in the summer and spring, and then about 1/4 teaspoon in the winter. I eyeball it. I just use the little teaspoon that's in the cup, and then I just do that, and I know more or less how much is in the water. So about 1/2 teaspoon I use, and what I've calculated is for my exact water, that's about 133 parts per million per 1/4 teaspoon, or 266 parts per million for 1/2 teaspoon. So I highly recommend you guys check out following the instructions. Use a TDS meter. You could do it a couple times, see if it's relatively stable, and then when you're putting your mix together, you know the ratios that you need to use. It got loud outside, sorry about that. So it's about 266 parts per million because I have 1/2 teaspoon and I've measured it, so I know more or less about how much it is. But I also like to add kelp, or I like to add Superthrive into the mix. And what I do is I just follow the instructions. I use the Bloom City clean kelp, and I just follow the instructions, and that is 5 milliliters per gallon. So I just add this in there. I don't check the TDS after I do that, just because I know more or less it's just adding a bit more, and my primary concern is what's in the actual fertilizer with the nitrogen and all that. So I'll alternate between this kelp, and I also alternate with the Superthrive, and the Superthrive is 1/4 teaspoon per gallon, so I'll do that as well. And I don't measure after the after I've measured out the actual MSU fertilizer. I don't think it's super relevant. It doesn't have to be exactly precise. I just want to make sure I know more or less what's in here. So I do that, and then I water all of my orchids. So whether they're organic or inorganic, I water them. For the orchids in SemiHydro, they're constantly fed, so there's a water reservoir. They're constantly pulling up nutrients, so they do pretty well. Once a month, I will flush all of my pots, whether they're organic or inorganic. So I try to feed 3 times per month in my organic setup, but I feed all the time for my inorganic setup. So when I flush the orchids in SemiHydro, I feed them right away. And something I like to do every 6 weeks is, instead of giving them MSU fertilizer, I give them some Calmag. So about every 6 weeks, I just feel like the MSU fertilizer does help a lot because it does have calcium and magnesium. but I like to give them a little bit more supplemental calcium and magnesium. So every 6 weeks, I follow the instructions on here. This brand is the General Hydroponics brand, Calmag, and I just follow the instructions. I don't really care as much about the parts per million on this one. I just follow what they say, and that is use 1 milliliter per liter, or 1 teaspoon per gallon. So that is what I do once every 6 weeks. I'm having good success with it. My orchids are growing well, so they get a big boost of calcium and magnesium every 6 weeks. The rest of the time they're getting this, so they stay pretty well fed. So let's talk about the last piece that I think is important, but also I think you can play around with it without having to go crazy with a TDS meter, and that is pH. So when you grow your orchids in SemiHydro, you're not getting the acidity from the organic bark or moss. A lot of that is naturally acidic, and it acidifies the water a little bit. And when you're feeding your orchids, they absorb nutrients at different pH levels, but optimally you want to be between 5.5 and 6.5. A pH closer to 6 is ideal. Some nutrients are absorbed at lower levels, some at higher levels, but generally I want to feed between 5.5 and 6.5. I will link a channel down below, Rick L, where he used to alternate the pH that he fed his orchid, because he realized that his orchids would absorb nutrients at lower levels and higher levels. There's different charts you can study to see this, but I think it is prudent to maybe sometimes feed at 5.5, sometimes 6.5, but you don't have to. You don't have to complicate your life with this. To keep things simple, what I suggest is testing your pH in the pH in your water, so you can see whether it's naturally acidic or alkaline or anything like that. And then you can test it as you make your nutrient mix. So what I do is I will use the pH down because my pH is a little bit higher than 6. So I normally get it between 7 and 8. And then I see about how many drops I need regularly to bring it down to a pH of 6. So I do it maybe every month or so to make sure that my readings are still about the same. But if you test it out and you see that your pH is, say, 5.5 or something like that, generally you're fine. You may want to use a little pH up if it's lower than that. But if you test it out, I don't think you have to test your pH every single time. So that's the method that I use, so I don't go crazy bringing out all of the TDS meters and the pH meters. You do have to do a check-in every now and then to make sure nothing changed. One thing did change with me back last summer, where my water source changed from one reservoir from another reservoir, and the pH actually changed significantly, where it went from like a 6.5 to an 8, so I had to make an adjustment. But maybe you could check once a month to make sure nothing changes with your water, or if it's pretty stable, you know how many drops you need to lower your pH. Let me know down below if that all makes sense. I've already put a nutrient mix together, and I'm going to show you how I test it out with this pH indicator right here. It comes with the pH up and pH down, but generally it tells you, depending on the color, what the pH is. Don't have to be super precise. You can get a pH meter to check it out, but I just use this. So I'll know more or less what color, and I'm aiming for this yellow over here. So I'm going to show you what my pH looks like. And if we need to make adjustments, I know how many drops more or less, how many milliliters I will have to add to change the pH. So I've added my fertilized water here, and we have to add 3 to 5 drops of this pH test indicator in here and see what color it turns into. So we've added it here, and we're going to shake it up. So this actually is looking pretty good. So the color that we're aiming for is actually the color that I'm looking for, so I don't have to make any adjustments. So we are all good. Now if your pH came out like red like that, then you would have to add some pH up until you get to 6. And if your pH came out more green, you'd pH down to make sure you get between 5.5 and 6.5. So this is not too bad. Here's another view. This is like a yellow-green, so it's, I believe the pH for this is between 6 and 6.5, and I'm totally cool with that. So I'm not going to be adjusting my pH this time, but if you did want to make it more acidic, you could. Then you can use this dropper to see, maybe add 1 milliliter at a time until you get your desired pH, and then you can remember how you made that adjustment so you don't have to constantly test. So my pH was spot on. I didn't have to make any adjustments, and I'm just going to go ahead and feed my orchids with that water that I prepared. I'm having a lot of success with feeding my orchids in this way. I really like that MSU fertilizer. Back when I first started growing, I used the commercial stuff that you'd get at the big box retailers, like Miracle Grow, and I just found that that kind of fertilizer burned my roots. I also found that when I checked the TDS on the recommended amount, I think it was something like 600 parts per million. It was very high. So I think it is important to check, follow the instructions, but check what the TDS is. Then you can make adjustments, and then you can add supplemental items such as the Kelp, which I didn't mention, but I use this mostly in the summer. Otherwise, I just feed with the MSU fertilizer on its own. And then you have a little bit more leeway. So that big box fertilizer that I used to use, it also used to burn my Phalaenopsis roots, and I always wondered why. Some folks say it's because it didn't have the calcium and magnesium. Other folks say that it's because the dose is too high or the formula, but I moved away from using that, and I have much more success with MSU fertilizer, supplemented with a little bit of Kelp. Once in a while I'll add a little Superthrive. My Cattleyas in particular bloom constantly. They get good light, but I do think feeding is a big factor in why they're doing well. I think light is most important than feeding the orchid, than making sure they get plenty of air and that they're kept nice and moist as well. But I also like doing this Calmag every 6 weeks. Make sure there's no deficiencies, make sure they grow nice and strong. Anyway, guys, let me know if this video was helpful. If you liked it, let me know down below, and if you have any questions, I will answer. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye, everyone.